What if everything you built your life on crumbled in a single day? What if the very foundation of your existence was ripped away without warning, without explanation, without mercy? What if everyone you trusted turned against you and the silence from above became deafening? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most devastating stories ever told, a story that will challenge everything you think you know about suffering, faith, and the nature of existence itself. This isn't just another tale from ancient times. This is the story of a man who lost everything that mattered, who faced unimaginable torment, and who was forced to confront the darkest questions that haunt the human soul. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this story has gripped humanity for thousands of years, why it continues to shake people to their core, and why it might just change how you see your own struggles forever. My name is here to guide you through this incredible narrative, and I've spent countless hours researching every detail, every twist, every heartbreaking moment of this epic tale. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a masterpiece of human drama that explores the very essence of what it means to be alive in a world that doesn't always make sense. But before we begin, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. See, most people think they know this story, but they only know fragments, pieces, the sanitized version that misses the raw power and brutal honesty of what really happened. We're going to uncover the full truth, the complete picture, and trust me, it's going to leave you speechless. So settle in, because what you're about to experience is going to take you on an emotional roller coaster that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, purpose, and the meaning of suffering itself. In a time when the world was young and wild, when vast deserts stretched beyond imagination and mighty cities rose from the sands, there lived a man whose name would echo through eternity. This man wasn't a king or a warrior or a prophet. He was something far more extraordinary. He was completely good. Picture this if you can. Imagine a person so upright, so genuinely decent, that even his enemies couldn't find fault with him. Imagine someone so wealthy that his possessions stretched as far as the eye could see, yet so humble that he never forgot where his blessings came from. Imagine a father so devoted that he would wake before dawn to pray for his children, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because he loved them that much. This was Job, and his story begins not in tragedy, but in triumph. The land where Job lived was harsh and unforgiving, a place where only the strong survived and only the wise prospered. Yet Job didn't just survive, he thrived. His name was spoken with respect in every marketplace. His wisdom was sought by rulers and common folk alike, and his generosity was legendary throughout the region. But here's what made Job truly remarkable. In a world where wealth often corrupted and power usually destroyed, Job remained pure. He didn't cheat his workers or exploit the poor. He didn't abuse his position or ignore the suffering of others. Instead, he used his blessings to bless others, turning his prosperity into a force for good in a world that desperately needed it. His household was a marvel to behold. 7 sons, each one strong and capable, each one carrying forward their father's values. 3 daughters, each one beautiful and wise, each one treasured beyond measure. Servants who weren't treated as slaves but as family members. Workers who were paid fairly and treated with dignity. And the wealth, oh, the wealth was staggering. Picture vast herds stretching to the horizon, thousands upon thousands of sheep covering the hillsides, like living clouds. Imagine caravans of camels, those ships of the desert, carrying goods and treasures across the ancient trade routes. Envision fields filled with powerful oxen, their strength harnessed for the harvest, and swift donkeys ready to carry messages and supplies wherever they were needed. This wasn't just wealth, this was an empire built on righteousness, a kingdom founded on integrity. Job had achieved what so many throughout history have tried and failed to accomplish. He had gained the whole world without losing his soul. But what made Job's prosperity even more remarkable was how he handled it. Every morning, before the sun painted the eastern sky, Job would rise and make his way to the place of worship. There, he would offer sacrifices, not for himself, but for his children. Not because they had sinned, but because he wanted to make sure they were right with the divine. Perhaps, he would whisper as the smoke rose toward heaven, perhaps my children have somehow offended in their hearts. Let me cover them. Let me protect them. Let me ensure they remain blameless. This was the rhythm of Job's life. Work hard, prosper honestly, share generously, and never ever forget the source of all good things. He was living proof that it was possible to be both successful and righteous, both wealthy and pure. His children had inherited not just his wealth, but his character. They loved each other deeply, gathering regularly for feasts and celebrations. The brothers would take turns hosting, and each time they would invite their sisters to join them. These weren't wild parties or reckless celebrations. These were family gatherings filled with joy, laughter, and genuine affection. And every time his children gathered, Job would worry. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because he loved them so much that he couldn't bear the thought of anything separating them from the divine blessing that covered their family. This was Job's world, a world of blessing, prosperity, love, and faithfulness. A world where goodness was rewarded, where integrity led to success, where following the right path resulted in a life worth living. It was a world that made sense, a world where the good guys won and evil was kept at bay. But what Job didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that his very goodness had attracted attention from the highest places. His righteousness had become the subject of a cosmic debate. His faithfulness, the center of a challenge that would shake the foundations of existence itself. Far above the earth, beyond the realm of human understanding, in the council chambers of eternity, a conversation was taking place that would change everything. The divine court was in session, and among those present was an entity whose very name means the accuser, a being whose job it was to find fault, to expose weakness, to prove that goodness was nothing more than a facade. And this accuser had noticed Job. "Have you seen this man?" the challenge began. "This so-called righteous one, this supposedly perfect human being?" The response came with pride and affection. "Indeed, there is no one like him on earth. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears what is holy and turns away from evil." But the accuser wasn't convinced. With a voice dripping with cynicism and contempt, the challenge was issued. "Of course, he serves you faithfully. Look at how you've blessed him. You've put a protective hedge around him and his household and everything he has. You've blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The accusation was devastating in its simplicity. Job's goodness, according to the accuser, was nothing more than a business transaction. He was faithful because faithfulness paid well. He was righteous because righteousness was profitable. Strip away the blessings, and the true nature of this so-called perfect man would be revealed. It was a challenge that cut to the very heart of human nature itself. Are we good because goodness is rewarded, or are we good because goodness is right? Do we serve the divine because of what we get in return, or do we serve because it's who we are meant to be? The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about one man's faith. This was about the very nature of love, loyalty, and righteousness itself. If the accuser was right, then all of human devotion was nothing more than selfishness dressed up in religious clothes. If Job's faith was genuine, then perhaps there was hope for humanity after all. And so, with a weight that seemed to press down on the very fabric of reality, permission was granted. Very well, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. The die was cast. The test was about to begin, and Job, going about his daily routine, completely unaware of the cosmic drama unfolding around him, was about to discover just how much a human soul can endure. What happened next would shatter not just Job's world, but challenge everything we think we know about justice, suffering, and the meaning of faith itself. The man who had everything was about to lose it all, and in that losing, he would teach us lessons about the human spirit that echo through the ages. But the accuser wasn't finished yet. This was only the beginning of a test that would push Job to the very limits of human endurance, a trial that would strip away everything he held dear and force him to confront the most fundamental questions of existence. The stage was set. The challenge had been accepted. And somewhere in the land of Uz, a righteous man was about to face the fight of his life, not knowing that the entire universe was watching to see what he would do when everything fell apart. The morning started like any other in Job's household. The sun crested the horizon, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The servants were already about their duties, tending to the vast herds that stretched across the landscape. The sound of bleating sheep and lowing cattle filled the air, a symphony of prosperity that had become the soundtrack of Job's life. Job himself was likely reviewing the day's business, perhaps planning which fields to plant next, or considering a new trade route for his caravans. His sons and daughters were going about their lives, secure in the knowledge that they were protected, provided for, and deeply loved. It was a scene of perfect domestic bliss, a picture of what life could be when everything went according to plan. But in the unseen realm, the wheels of fate were already turning. The accuser had been given permission, and now it was time to put Job's faith to the ultimate test. What was about to unfold would happen with such brutal efficiency, such devastating precision, that it would leave everyone who witnessed it stunned and speechless. The first messenger arrived as Job was conducting his morning affairs. This wasn't unusual. Messengers came and went regularly in a household as large and prosperous as Job's. But something was different about this one. His clothes were torn, his face was streaked with dirt and tears, and his eyes held a wild, desperate look that immediately set everyone on edge. "Master," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath, his voice cracking with emotion. "Master, I bring terrible news." Job looked up from his work, concern creasing his features. In all his years of business, he had dealt with setbacks before. Markets fluctuated, weather could be unpredictable, and occasionally deals fell through. But something about this messenger's demeanor suggested this was far worse than any ordinary business problem. "The oxen were plowing," the messenger continued, his words coming out in a rush, as if he needed to get them out before his courage failed him. "The donkeys were grazing peacefully nearby, just as they do every day. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be." Job nodded, waiting for the rest of the report. Perhaps some animals had wandered off, or maybe there had been an accident with the equipment. These things happened in agricultural work, but then the messenger's voice dropped to a whisper, and the words that came next hit Job like a physical blow. The Sabians attacked without warning. They came like a storm, like locusts descending on a field. They swept down on us with swords and spears, and they took everything. Every ox, every donkey, gone. The blood drained from Job's face. The Sabians were known raiders, fierce nomadic tribes who struck without warning and disappeared back into the desert. But they had never dared to attack Job's holdings before. His reputation, his connections, his sheer size had always provided protection. "The servants," Job asked quietly, though part of him already knew the answer from the look in the messenger's eyes. "Dead," came the whispered reply. "All of them. Cut down where they stood. They didn't even have time to run. I only escaped because I was sent to fetch water from the well. When I returned..." The messenger's voice broke completely. I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Before Job could even process this devastating news, before he could begin to understand what had just happened to his life, another figure appeared on the horizon. Another messenger, running toward the house with the same desperate urgency, the same look of horror and disbelief. Job's heart began to pound. One attack might be explained as bad luck, as being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but two messengers arriving in quick succession could only mean one thing. This was no isolated incident. The second messenger collapsed at Job's feet, gasping for air, his body shaking with exhaustion and trauma. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a terror that seemed to come from witnessing something beyond human comprehension. "Master!" he wheezed. "The fire fell from heaven." Aho! Job stared at him, not understanding. Fire from heaven? What could that possibly mean? "I was with the shepherds in the eastern pasture," the messenger continued, his voice growing stronger as he forced himself to deliver his message. "We were watching the flocks, counting the newborn lambs, planning the shearing schedule. It was a beautiful morning, peaceful and calm." He paused, swallowing hard, as if the memory was too painful to voice. Then the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with something else, something unnatural, and suddenly fire began to fall. Not lightning, not ordinary fire, but something that burned hotter and brighter than anything I've ever seen. It consumed everything it touched. Job felt his legs grow weak. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. To people who lived righteously and followed all the rules. "The sheep," the messenger whispered. "All 7,000 of them. Gone. Burned to nothing. And the shepherds, the men who had worked for you for years, who had families and children of their own. They tried to run, but the fire was faster. It caught them all." He looked up at Job with eyes that seemed to have aged decades in a single morning. "I am the only one who escaped to tell you." The world began to spin around Job. In the space of minutes, he had lost thousands of animals and dozens of human lives. People who had trusted him, who had worked for him, who had become like family over the years. Gone. All gone. But even as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of these losses, a third figure appeared in the distance. Another messenger, another bearer of news that would shatter what remained of Job's world. This one was younger, perhaps barely out of his teens, and he was weeping openly as he ran. His youth made his tears even more heartbreaking, a reminder that tragedy doesn't spare anyone, regardless of age or innocence. "The camels," he sobbed as he reached Job's courtyard. "Master, they took all the camels. 3,000 camels." Job's mind reeled at the number. These weren't just animals. They were his connection to the wider world. Camels were the ships of the desert, the means by which goods and messages traveled across the vast distances that separated civilizations. Without them, Job's trading empire would collapse completely. "The Chaldeans," the young messenger continued, his voice breaking with each word. "They came in 3 groups, surrounding the herds so none could escape. They were organized, efficient, like they had been planning this for months." Job realized with growing horror that these attacks weren't random. Someone had been watching his operations, studying his routines, learning his weaknesses. This was a coordinated assault designed to destroy him completely. "The camel drivers fought bravely," the messenger said, his voice filled with admiration for men who were now dead. "They didn't run, even when they saw they were outnumbered. They stood their ground, trying to protect what belonged to you. But there were too many attackers, and they were too well armed." Another pause, another moment of silence for lives that had been cut short in service to a master who could no longer protect them. "I am the only one who escaped to tell you." 3 messengers, 3 devastating reports, and Job could see in the distance that there was a 4th figure approaching, moving with the same urgent desperation as the others. His mind began to shut down, unable to process the scale of what was happening to him. In less than an hour, he had lost virtually everything he owned. His livelihood, his security, his means of supporting not just his family, but the hundreds of people who depended on him for their survival. But as the fourth messenger drew closer, Job realized with a growing sense of dread that the worst might still be yet to come. The look on this messenger's face was different from the others. Where they had shown shock and horror at the loss of property and servants, this one carried something deeper, something that spoke of a loss so profound that it defied description. The fourth messenger reached the courtyard and collapsed completely, unable even to stand. His whole body was shaking, and when he tried to speak, only sobs came out. Job knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, somehow finding the strength to comfort this bearer of news, even as his own world crumbled around him. "Take your time," Job said softly, though every fibre of his being screamed to know what fresh horror awaited him. Finally, the messenger looked up, and Job saw in his eyes a pain so deep, so overwhelming, that it seemed to reach into Job's soul and tear something vital from it. "Your children," the messenger whispered, and Job felt his heart stop beating. "They were together," the messenger continued, each word falling like a hammer blow. "All 10 of them, gathered at your eldest son's house for their regular feast. They were laughing, celebrating, enjoying each other's company just as they always did." Job's vision began to blur. His children, his precious children, the lights of his life, the reason he worked so hard and worried so much and prayed so faithfully every morning. "A wind came," the messenger said, his voice barely audible now. "But not a normal wind. Something powerful beyond imagination, like the breath of giants or the anger of the sky itself. It struck the house from all 4 directions at once. The messenger's voice broke completely, and he buried his face in his hands. The house collapsed. All of it. The walls, the roof, everything came down at once. There was no time to run, no time to escape. They were all inside when it happened. Job felt something inside him die. Not his faith, not yet, but something fundamental about who he was and how he understood the world. His children, his beautiful, loving, innocent children, were gone. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. 4 messengers, 4 reports, and in the space of perhaps an hour, Job's entire world had been systematically destroyed. His wealth, his livelihood, his security, and most devastating of all, his family. Everything that had made his life worth living had been stripped away with surgical precision. But this was only the beginning. Job stood in the wreckage of his life, surrounded by the 4 messengers who had delivered the most devastating news any father could ever receive. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of weeping from the men who had witnessed these unspeakable tragedies. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Job remained perfectly still. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. This morning, he had awakened as one of the wealthiest, most blessed men on earth. Now, as the sun reached its peak in the sky, he had nothing left except the clothes on his back and the breath in his lungs. But it was the loss of his children that cut deepest. The oxen could be replaced, the sheep could be repurchased, even the camels could eventually be acquired again. But his sons and daughters, those precious souls who had brought such joy and meaning to his existence, they were gone forever. No amount of wealth could bring them back. No power on earth could undo what had been done. The servants and workers who remained alive watched their master with a mixture of fear and anticipation. How would a man respond to such complete devastation? Would he rage against the heavens? Would he curse the day he was born? Would he blame the divine for allowing such horrors to befall a righteous man? Instead, Job did something that stunned everyone present. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Without saying a word, he reached for his robe, the fine garment that marked his status and prosperity, and with his own hands, he tore it from top to bottom. The sound of ripping fabric echoed through the courtyard, like a cry of anguish made audible. Then, in an act that spoke to the depths of his grief, Job took a blade and began to shave his head. This was the ancient way of mourning, the physical expression of internal devastation. As locks of hair fell to the ground around him, each strand seemed to carry with it a memory of happier times, of children's laughter, of prosperity and blessing. But what happened next would be remembered for thousands of years to come. Instead of shaking his fist at the heavens, instead of demanding answers or railing against the injustice of what had occurred, Job fell to his knees and then prostrated himself completely on the ground in an act of worship. The words that came from his lips in that moment would echo through history, becoming one of the most profound statements of faith ever uttered by human tongue. "Naked I came from my mother's womb," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, with a strength that seemed impossible given his circumstances. "And naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Those who witnessed this moment stood in absolute amazement. Here was a man who had lost everything that most people would consider worth having, and yet his response was not bitterness, but worship, not accusation, but acceptance, not cursing, but blessing. The servants whispered among themselves, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. This was not the reaction of a man whose faith had been built on prosperity. This was the response of someone whose trust ran deeper than circumstances, whose relationship with the divine transcended the material blessings of this world. Word of Job's response spread quickly throughout the region. People came from far and wide just to see the man who had worshipped in the midst of unimaginable loss. Some came expecting to find a broken shell of his former self. Others came hoping to witness a spectacular breakdown. But all who saw him left with the same sense of awe and confusion. How could a man maintain his faith when faith seemed to have failed him so completely? How could he bless the name of the divine when everything good in his life had been systematically destroyed? It defied human logic, challenged conventional wisdom, and forced everyone who witnessed it to question their own understanding of what true faith really meant. But in the unseen realm, the cosmic drama was far from over. The accuser had watched Job's response with growing frustration and disbelief. This wasn't how the test was supposed to go. Men weren't supposed to worship when they lost everything. They were supposed to reveal their true nature, to show that their devotion was nothing more than a transaction based on blessing and prosperity. Yet Job had done the unthinkable. He had maintained his integrity even when maintaining it seemed to serve no purpose. He had blessed the divine even when the divine seemed to have abandoned him. He had proved that there was something in the human heart that transcended mere self-interest, something that the accuser had perhaps underestimated, but the accuser wasn't finished. There was still one more test to be applied, one final probe into the depths of human faithfulness. If Job could worship while losing his possessions and even his children, what would happen when the attack became personal? What would happen when his own body became the battlefield? The challenge was issued once again in the council chambers of eternity. "Skin for skin," the accuser declared with renewed confidence. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." It was a chilling proposition. The accuser was essentially arguing that while Job might be willing to sacrifice his wealth and even his family, when faced with personal physical suffering, his true nature would finally be revealed. Self-preservation, the accuser claimed, was the strongest instinct of all, and when that instinct was threatened, all pretense of righteousness would crumble. Once again, permission was granted, but with a crucial limitation. "Very well, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." And so, the second phase of Job's testing began, a phase that would take the assault from external losses to internal torment, from the loss of what he had to the corruption of who he was. Job woke one morning to find his body covered with painful sores. These weren't ordinary wounds or typical illnesses. They were boils that erupted from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, covering every inch of his skin with inflamed, oozing lesions that brought constant, excruciating pain. The agony was beyond description. Every movement sent waves of torture through his nervous system. His skin, once healthy and strong, became a mass of infected tissue that wept and bled and refused to heal. Sleep became impossible as the pain never relented, never gave him even a moment's respite from the torment. But the physical suffering was only part of the ordeal. The social implications were equally devastating. In ancient times, such conditions were often viewed as signs of divine displeasure, evidence that the sufferer had committed some terrible sin that had brought this judgment upon them. Job, who had been respected and honored throughout the region, now became an object of fear and revulsion. People who had once sought his counsel now crossed the street to avoid him. Friends who had enjoyed his hospitality now whispered among themselves about what hidden sins he must have committed to deserve such obvious divine punishment. The man who had been a pillar of the community became its pariah, cast out and avoided by all who had once claimed to care for him. Unable to bear the sight and smell of his condition within the city walls, Job made his way to the place where ashes were dumped, the refuse heap outside the town where garbage and waste were burned. There, among the discarded remnants of other people's lives, he sat in the dust and debris, scraping at his sores with broken pieces of pottery in a futile attempt to find some relief from the constant burning and itching. The mighty Job, the man who had commanded respect and wielded influence, the father who had been surrounded by loving children, and the master who had governed vast holdings, now sat alone in the ash heap like a discarded piece of refuse himself. His wealth was gone, his family was dead, his health was destroyed, and his reputation was in ruins. It was there, in that place of ultimate degradation, that Job's wife found him. She looked at the man she had married, the man who had provided for her and protected her and loved her, and she saw nothing but a shadow of his former self. The sight of his suffering, combined with her own grief over the loss of their children, had pushed her beyond the limits of her endurance. "Are you still holding on to your integrity?" she asked, her voice filled with bitterness and despair. Curse God and die. It was perhaps the most heartbreaking moment in the entire story. Here was the woman who had shared Job's life, who had celebrated his successes and enjoyed his prosperity, and even she had reached the point where she could no longer see any purpose in maintaining faith. From her perspective, Job's righteousness had brought nothing but devastation. His integrity had been rewarded with disaster. His faithfulness had been answered with abandonment. Her words carried the weight of human logic and natural emotion. Why continue to worship a divine being who had allowed such horrors to befall them? Why maintain integrity when integrity seemed to serve no purpose? Why not just abandon faith entirely and end the suffering once and for all? But Job's response revealed the true depth of his character. Looking at his wife with eyes that still held love despite all the pain, he gently rebuked her despair. "You are speaking like one of the foolish women," he said. "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Even in his lowest moment, even when his own wife had given up hope, even when everything that made life worth living had been stripped away, Job refused to abandon his faith. He understood something that escaped even those closest to him, that true faith isn't dependent on circumstances, that genuine righteousness doesn't exist merely to be rewarded, and that the relationship between the human and the divine transcends the material blessings of this world. Word of Job's condition eventually reached 3 of his closest friends: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite had known Job for years. They had witnessed his prosperity, admired his wisdom, and respected his character. When they heard about the calamities that had befallen him, they made arrangements to travel from their distant homes to comfort him in his time of need. But when they arrived and saw him from a distance, they hardly recognized the man sitting in the ash heap. The Job they had known was strong, dignified, and commanding. This figure before them was broken, diseased, and barely human in appearance. The shock of seeing their friend in such a condition was so overwhelming that they began to weep aloud, tearing their own robes and throwing dust on their heads in expressions of grief. For 7 days and 7 nights, these 3 friends sat with Job in complete silence. They understood instinctively that words were inadequate for such suffering, that sometimes the greatest gift one person can give another is simply their presence. In their silence, they honored both Job's pain and the magnitude of what had happened to him. But silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can only last so long. And when Job finally opened his mouth to speak, what came out wasn't worship or blessing or patient acceptance. Instead, it was a cry of anguish so profound, so raw, that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of existence itself. Job cursed the day of his birth. The words that poured from his lips were unlike anything his friends had ever heard from him before. This wasn't the measured wisdom they remembered. This wasn't the patient counsel that had made him famous throughout the region. This was the sound of a human soul pushed beyond its breaking point. "Let the day perish on which I was born," Job cried out, his voice echoing across the ash heap like a wounded animal's howl. "And the night that said, 'A man-child is conceived.' Though, let that day be darkness. Let God above not seek it, nor let the light shine upon it." His friends listened in stunned silence as Job wished he had never existed at all. He longed for death, searched for it like men search for hidden treasure, yearned for the grave as a place of rest and peace. The man who had once celebrated life now saw it as nothing but an endless source of torment. This was more than his friends could bear. Surely, they reasoned, such extreme suffering could only mean one thing. Job must have committed some terrible sin, some hidden transgression that had brought this divine judgment upon him. Their silence gave way to speeches. Their comfort turned to accusations. Eliphaz spoke first, his words dripping with false wisdom and misguided certainty. "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent," he demanded. "Or where were the righteous ever cut off? Those who plough iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." The implication was devastating. According to Eliphaz, Job's suffering was proof of his guilt. Good people didn't experience such tragedies unless they had done something to deserve them. The universe was just, he argued, and justice demanded that the righteous prosper while the wicked suffer. Bildad joined the assault with his own brand of cruel logic. "Does God pervert judgment?" he asked rhetorically. "Or does the Almighty pervert justice? If your sons have sinned against him, he has cast them away for their transgression." Even more heartlessly, he suggested that Job's children had died because of their own sins, that their deaths were justified punishment for some wrongdoing. The grief-stricken father was being told that his beloved children had deserved their fate. Zophar completed the trilogy of misguided counselors with perhaps the most brutal accusation of all. "Should your lies make men hold their peace?" he sneered. "For you have said, 'My doctrine is pure, and I am clean in your eyes.' But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you and show you the secrets of wisdom. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves." According to Zophar, Job was actually getting off easy. His suffering, no matter how severe, was less than what he truly deserved for his hidden sins. But Job refused to accept their accusations. Even in his agony, even when his own friends had turned against him, He maintained his innocence with a fierce determination that only strengthened as their attacks intensified. "I will maintain my righteousness and will not let it go," he declared with a passion that seemed to burn through his physical pain. "My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live." The debate raged on, round after round of accusations and defenses, of theological arguments and personal attacks. Job's friends were absolutely convinced that his suffering proved his guilt, while Job remained equally certain of his innocence. It was a stalemate that revealed something profound about human nature and our desperate need to make sense of senseless suffering. But then, when the arguments had exhausted themselves and the accusations had run their course, when human wisdom had proven inadequate to explain the inexplicable, something extraordinary happened. The sky began to darken, not with ordinary storm clouds, but with something far more ominous and powerful. A whirlwind formed on the horizon, growing larger and more intense with each passing moment. This wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. This was something else entirely. Something that spoke of power beyond human comprehension and wisdom beyond human understanding. And from the heart of that whirlwind came a voice that silenced every argument, that rendered every accusation meaningless, that put an end to all human attempts to explain the unexplainable. It was the voice of the Almighty himself. And when he spoke, the very foundations of the earth seemed to tremble. "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" the voice thundered. "Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." What followed was not an explanation, but an interrogation, not comfort but challenge, not answers but questions that revealed the vast gulf between human understanding and divine wisdom. God didn't explain why Job had suffered. Instead, he revealed the limitations of human knowledge and the smallness of human perspective. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" came the first question. And with it came the realization that Job, for all his righteousness and wisdom, was still just a finite creature trying to understand an infinite reality. Question after question poured forth, each one demonstrating the magnificent complexity of creation and the utter impossibility of any human being truly comprehending the mind of the divine. From the mysteries of the cosmos to the intricacies of the natural world, from the behavior of wild animals to the power of the ocean, God painted a picture of reality so vast and complex that it dwarfed every human concern. Job listened in awe and growing humility as the voice from the whirlwind revealed the true scope of divine power and wisdom. He began to understand that his questions, legitimate as they were, had been asked from a perspective so limited that they were essentially meaningless. He was like an ant trying to comprehend the workings of a computer, like a child attempting to understand quantum physics. When the divine questioning finally ended, Job found himself completely transformed. Not because his questions had been answered, but because he had encountered something so much greater than his questions that they no longer seemed to matter. "I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder and reverence. "But now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." This wasn't the repentance of a guilty man admitting his crimes. This was the humbling of a finite being who had encountered the infinite, the surrender of human pride in the face of divine majesty. Job hadn't been wrong to question or wrong to maintain his innocence, but he had been wrong to think that his perspective was sufficient to judge the ways of the Almighty. And with that moment of humility and surrender, everything began to change. God turned his attention to Job's 3 friends, and his judgment was swift and decisive. They had spoken falsely about him, had reduced his justice to their own limited understanding, had added cruelty to their friend's suffering by insisting that he must deserve his fate. "My wrath is aroused against you," God declared to Eliphaz, "for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." The irony was stunning. Job, who had questioned and complained and demanded answers, was commended for speaking rightly about God. His friends, who had defended divine justice and insisted on the righteousness of God's ways, were condemned for their false theology. But even in his anger, God provided a path to redemption. The three friends were instructed to offer sacrifices and ask Job to pray for them. The man they had accused and tormented would become their intercessor, the one whose prayers would secure their forgiveness. And Job, despite everything they had put him through, prayed for them willingly. In that act of intercession, he demonstrated a grace and forgiveness that transcended human understanding, showing that his righteousness wasn't just about following rules, but about embodying the very character of the divine. When Job prayed for his friends, when he chose forgiveness over revenge and mercy over justice, something miraculous began to happen. His fortunes were restored, but not just restored, they were doubled. Where he had once owned 7,000 sheep, now he had 14,000. His 3,000 camels became 6,000. His 1,000 oxen became 2,000. But perhaps most remarkably, he was blessed with children again. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him, and these children were described as the most beautiful in all the land. Job named his daughters Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch, and he loved them so much that he gave them an inheritance alongside their brothers, something almost unheard of in that culture. Job lived another 140 years after his trials, long enough to see his children and his grandchildren, and even his great-grandchildren. He died at last, full of years and surrounded by those who loved him, having learned lessons about faith and suffering and the nature of divine wisdom that would echo through the ages. His story became a testament to the complexity of human suffering and the inadequacy of simple explanations for life's greatest mysteries. It challenged the notion that good people always prosper and bad people always suffer, revealing instead a universe far more complex and mysterious than human understanding can fully grasp. But most importantly, Job's story demonstrated that true faith doesn't depend on understanding, that genuine righteousness isn't contingent on reward, and that the human spirit, when grounded in something greater than itself, can endure even the most devastating trials and emerge not just intact, but transformed. Today, thousands of years later, Job's questions still echo in the hearts of anyone who has ever suffered without explanation, who has ever wondered why bad things happen to good people, who has ever felt abandoned by the very forces they trusted to protect them. His story offers no easy answers, but it offers something perhaps more valuable: the assurance that our questions are heard, our suffering is seen, and our faith, however tested, can ultimately triumph over even the darkest circumstances. In the end, Job's horrific story becomes something beautiful, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the mysterious ways in which suffering can become the pathway to a deeper, richer, more authentic faith than prosperity could ever provide.